Clicking record. Brilliant. So welcome to the 5th peer learning session for the CLTN network. Hot off the heels of the Conservation Strategy Fund peer learning session, which was amazing. So thank you to that. Thank you to Natalia for that. And thank you for the great offers. I hope you've had some take up on some of those offers that you've shared with us. So these sessions are to allow others, to allow a space for our members to give an overview of the program's design, curriculum, lessons, challenges. It can be on any aspect or the entire program, or you can pitch a concept that you're working on that you'd like collective input on. And actually the June peer learning session is just that, because we have an alumni of our course who's creating a new conservation leadership program in Latin America. So she is after your advice. So I do all encourage you to come if you can. These are being recorded and added to our playlist, and I will drop that in the chat as well, so you can catch up with any that you've missed. I'm now going to hand over to, well, in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Chris to tell you about our innovation and assessment here in Cambridge. But I just wanted to say, if you can keep yourself on mute during the presentations, that will be helpful, but it's nice to keep your camera on just so the presenter doesn't feel like he's speaking to no one. So yeah, if you're happy to keep your camera on where you can, that'd be great, but please keep yourself on mute. Feel free to drop anything that you want to say into the chat, and we'll have a sort of short presentation, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. I unfortunately have to leave, so I'm going to leave you in Chris's capable hands about 20 minutes early. So I'm now going to stop talking, and I'm going to hand over to you, Chris.
All right, thank you, Shelley, very much indeed, and great to see everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't make it to the previous one of these sessions, but yeah, really delighted that they're happening. I was just going to say it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here, and I've been in back-to-back meetings since 9 this morning, so I'm also slightly kind of trying to gather my thoughts to give this talk. But yeah, it's really good to have a chance to share some of what we've been doing with the Masters in Conservation Leadership, particularly around kind of trying to come up with some more creative and novel modes of assessment. And I'm really looking forward also to hearing your questions, feedback, thoughts. I mean, we've always seen the CLTN as a fantastic space for kind of sharing and mutual benefit and improvement. So if you've got ideas of things that we could do to further enhance what we're doing, that would be brilliant. I also recognize, just to say at the beginning, that not everyone in the network is kind of running programs that have a kind of formal assessment element to them, which is what I'm going to be talking about more today. But I would hope that even if not in a formal assessment context, some of these things are useful, because I think some of the approaches we've been taking might be relevant outside of that context as well. So yeah, maybe just to start off with just a minute or two on the Masters in Conservation Leadership in the big picture. I know some of you have heard about a lot of this in the past. It's a 1-year full-time professional master's program at the University of Cambridge. It's delivered by the whole collaboration, which is called the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is a partnership between the University of Cambridge and 10 international conservation organisations, which are all more or less co-located in the David Attenborough building in Cambridge, which is where I'm sitting now. So we have about 20 students per year. They're mid-career conservation professionals who have at least 3 years of professional experience post first degree, sometimes quite a lot more than that. And they're people who we think are at a kind of a stage of their career where they've either really demonstrated some leadership experience and potential, or we can kind of see that in their future. And they come to learn from each other and from all the people based in Cambridge for the course of a full year. They do 6 months of kind of courses and modules, and then an experiential phase of the Masters. They do a group consultancy project, and then they do an individual professional placement over the summer months. So that's actually just kicking off now at this phase in our cycle. And the students come from all over the world, so that's a really important feature of our program. We've had students from, I think it's 92 countries now worldwide. The course has been running since 2010. We actually have no European students at all this year, including the UK. So it's a kind of really very global international program. Yeah, so I'll kind of come on to then tell you a bit about the background to what we've been doing with our assessments and what we've been learning from that. So the master's has always had leadership as its kind of core thing. It's a master's in conservation leadership. We've always tried to emphasize that. We've always had a lot of experiential learning through the consultancy project, through the placement that I already mentioned. However, until fairly recently, the way that we actually assessed the performance of the students in the degree was completely dominated by writing, and mostly academic writing in the sort of quite traditional sense of writing essays and that kind of thing, you know, fully cited kind of essays and articles that had a bibliography and were written in an academic style, plus some oral assessments. They have a group oral assessment and an individual presentation. But again, those were quite formal, kind of a bit like giving a talk at a conference, sort of an exercise. And so we sometimes got to the end of the year and felt like some of the students who had perhaps got the best marks weren't necessarily the ones that we felt from our kind of day-to-day interactions with them in the classroom were the most inspiring leaders. That has happened a few times. And also having this kind of concern that the skills that people will actually need, the learning outcomes that we're trying to address through the program, are not all best assessed through a very kind of formal, traditional kind of written form of assessment. Because, you know, while we do certainly believe that there are some elements of being a leader which are well assessed by things like an essay, there are many others which clearly aren't. So we're a bit concerned about how good the fit was between our kind of assessment framework and the things that actually mattered in our program. So to try and address that, we brought in two new ways of doing assessments, starting in the 22-23 academic year. So we've now done kind of 2.5 years with this new system. And so we've kind of got to a point where I think we have some reflections that we can share about that. And we're using these new modes of assessment for two of our modules. So one of these is called Leading People and Organizations, which is basically about, as it kind of sounds, it's about running an organization or a team, and it covers topics like strategic planning, fundraising, human resources management, financial management, and so on. The other is a module called Leading Systems, which is a really big module. It actually used to be 3 separate modules, and we kind of merged them all into one. So it's got an element, a theme within it that's basically about incentive-based conservation, market-based conservation, and so on. It's got one that's about communication and one that's about governance. And we brought all of those together, and this is this big module called Leading Systems, which we now set up with a kind of systems thinking opening. And it's about basically how conservation seeks to have influence and bring about change in the world. So kind of, you know, thinking beyond our organizations to the actual impact that we want to have. We now assess that big module. It has 2 different assessments. So one is still a traditional academic essay. We get the students to go off and do a load of reading and you know, pick from 3 questions and write a 4,000-word essay. But we also get them to do one of these novel, more experiential forms of assessment. So I'll start off by telling you what we've been doing for the People and Organizations module. So what we've come up with there is a role-play based assessment in which the student, and we've currently just been using one broad kind of context, but with different scenarios within that. So the students are asked to play the part of the chief executive officer of a fictitious international conservation organization, which we call Save the Mammals International. We've been using it for quite a long time. We've got quite a rich backstory of this organization. It was, you know, founded in the 1950s by some British businessmen and all this kind of stuff. So we've got a kind of scenario of this organization that we've built up. We give the students a particular, what we say is that they've just been appointed to this role, maybe in the last 2 or 3 months. And then we give them a scenario for the assessment with background documents like an annual report, or maybe a letter from a staff member or whatever they need for this particular task. And we try to make the task and the scenario kind of quite challenging and open-ended. So it's not like there's sort of one obvious correct answer. It's much more kind of open and broad than that. So we've had one example we used was they'd just been appointed, and we gave them a load of background information, and we asked them to say, you know, what their analysis was of the current situation that the organization was in, and what their kind of vision and plans would be for the next year or so. So kind of like auditing where they were with things in the organization and saying what their way forward would be. And the other one that we just did this year was about a kind of scenario where there was a real crisis happening, and the organization was dealing with a kind of political emergency in one of their field programs and had to decide whether or not to kind of pull out and you know, pull out of a long-standing relationship with that country because of concerns about safety of the staff and that kind of thing. So when we give them the background documents, we kind of sprinkle in little things that might be a little bit concerning or interesting, and you know, maybe things that we're hoping that they might pick up on and spot, perhaps that the organization could have been doing differently and so on. And then what we do is we ask them to prepare for and then undertake a meeting, a kind of role play meeting with their board of trustees. So they submit a short written paper, maybe it's 1,000 words or so, like a week before the actual role play day, which is as if it was the board meeting paper, like the document that you would receive as a board member prior to the meeting that had been prepared by the chief exec. That sets out their broad analysis and approach. They come to the meeting, we ask them to present that verbally for 5 minutes without slides, just tell us verbally what their thinking is. And then we have 15 minutes for Q&A with these trustees. So these trustees are 4 of us normally, and they're played by me and Howard, who many of you know, who's the deputy director of the program, who's the other kind of academic team member. But also we have 2 people, a kind of changing cast of people, but we invite 2 people from the NGO community here who are themselves senior leaders in conservation organizations who come and role play trustees. And I think I saw Chloe on the call. Chloe's one of our trustees, so there you are, who's done this for us previously. And the idea is that the people who are pretending to be on this board are playing themselves, so they introduce themselves as themselves. They're not pretending to, you know, be somebody different. And the only thing that's not true is that they're not actually trustees of this organization, but otherwise they bring their real selves to the conversation, because that, I think none of us are professional actors, so that certainly makes that a bit easier. The board members, all 4 people who are playing the board members, have seen the submitted documents in advance, so we get to read for each student, you know, what their thinking was on this topic, and maybe tailor the questions we ask them to particular things that student picked up or didn't pick up in their documentation. But we broadly try and have each person ask questions on roughly the same topic, so that there's a degree of consistency across each one, and you know, that's important in terms of fairness for the assessment. We try to make it as realistic as possible, so that you know, from the moment the student kind of walks through the door, we are in role play mode, and we're, you know, asking them how they are, and, you know, how was your train journey today, and thank you for meeting at short notice, and all that. You know, so we really try and like make it a very real role play. And I think, you know, maybe with one exception across 3 years we've done this, I think basically every student has been very happy to kind of throw themselves into that role play scenario and, you know, kind of go along with it, if you like. Yeah. And then afterwards, Howard and I do the marking. So we ask for feedback from the other 2 people who are role playing the trustees. You know, how did you think that went? And we take some notes. But when it comes actually to the sort of assessment and marking process, you know, we're the ones who are doing that. The other people are there to sort of help with the process and make it real and make it a good experience for the students. I think it's gone really, really well, this approach. The students definitely find it difficult and quite challenging, but a lot of them perform really, really well in doing it. And actually, you know, definitely some of them who might have struggled a bit with writing a, you know, traditional academic essay kind of really blossom in this kind of quite high pressure, you know, interpersonal kind of scenario. So I think they've generally probably got slightly higher marks than they maybe were on the equivalent exercises previously. Yeah, we do some role play in class prior to using this as an assessment, so that they at least have some chance to kind of cut their teeth on that and not have it come out of the blue, because of course you don't want to be assessing a skill that you've never given students a chance to experience before. And maybe one thing just to say on this, which is a bit challenging for us, is it's quite time consuming. So it takes about, well, we have 20 minutes per student of actual interaction, but then you need another 10 minutes or so of kind of taking notes and welcome and goodbyes afterwards. You know, we have about 20 students in the class, so, you know, kind of 20 times half an hour is quite a long time to be actually doing it. And We've normally done it over 2 or 3 days with kind of half days, and the additional people that we ask to be trustees, we change each day because we know that busy people like Chloe can't be expected to give up kind of 3 half days to do this for us. So there's a limit to what we can do there. And I think if we had 50 plus students, it would be incredibly difficult to timetable this kind of thing. But yeah, that role play, it seems to have worked great, and we're keen to kind of carry on with doing something similar in the future. Right, and then I'll just go on and tell you about the other module that we do, where we do something a bit different. So this is for the leading systems module, and we're kind of particularly picking up on the communications element of that module with this particular assessment. So again, it's a role play, and again, it's kind of scenario based. In fact, sometimes we've used the same organization, Save the Mammals International, as we'd have on the previous one. This time, what the student is being asked to do, the main thing they're doing is a kind of recorded as live media interview. We've done it previously with radio. This year, we're actually doing it with TV. So we're doing it very soon. So we'll kind of see how it goes with cameras in the room. Again, the students get the scenario in advance, and they have to submit a short piece of text. This time, they're submitting text as if it were a statement to be published on their website. And then the person doing the interview gets to read those statements and to some extent tailor their questions to fit the particular ideas that the student is wanting to convey in their piece. And then they do the interview for something like 5 or 6 minutes. So it's basically the equivalent of doing a kind of news, TV news interview on the BBC or something like that. The interview is actually conducted by a professional media trainer who has previously done half-day workshops with the students in relatively small groups. So they've really had a proper go at learning the skills and having a kind of dry run in a non-assessed situation with somebody teaching them how to do it, which is definitely really important because it's hard and wouldn't be fair to do it like that otherwise. We record the interview, so the TV cameras will be rolling and they'll do it as live and end up with a 5-6 minute recording. And then Howard and I will actually assess the students based on their written submitted piece and the video audio file of the recording. So we do the assessment on a completely different day, and we won't necessarily be present in the room. We'll just get sent the file and use that for our marking. And actually, I should say in this case, we also will be co-marking. We'll split the class in half, and I will do half the class with a separate co-marker, and Howard will do the same. And our co-marker will be a communications professional from one of the NGOs that we work with. So they can basically say, that was really good, when we're saying we weren't sure because we're academics and we're not specialists in that area. So they'll be really helping us with that. The scenario that we're using this year is that we're saying that some kind of prominent public figure, conservationist commentator, has written a blog article accusing Save the Mammals International of being neo-colonial and acting inappropriately overseas, based from a UK power base. So it's a kind of question about decolonization and how they're going to respond to that accusation. And I'm hoping, we'll see because we haven't actually had the scenario, we haven't had it yet, but I'm hoping that we'll get a real range of responses, that some of the students might sort of play it very defensively and be explaining and justifying and, continuing with the current actions of the organization. Maybe some others will say, well, actually, I'm newly appointed in this role and these are issues I'm very concerned about. And actually, here are the things that we're trying to do to address them and maybe, move forward in a different way. So that would be really interesting for us if we get a range of responses to it. And yeah, as I say, we haven't tried it with TV so far, but we've done it before with radio, and that did seem to work really well. The students generally did a very good job, and it seemed to be helping them to kind of bring out the best of their kind of full range of skills. Yeah, I've just got a couple of sort of general reflections, and then I'll stop talking and open it up for some discussion. So yeah, one thing is we haven't yet had a kind of major problem with a student kind of not being able to do one of these modes of assessment because of some kind of personal challenge that they have. So for example, you might have a student who has very high anxiety and who would say it was too stressful and difficult to do this kind of very high pressure assessment, or they maybe might have some other kind of that might be hard of hearing or some other kind of challenge that might make it difficult. And so we haven't had to deal with that yet. So that's so far so good, but we will at some point, I'm sure. And we will just have to try and work out some adjustment that makes it a fair assessment. And I think when we were getting this through the various committees that we had to go through to get this to be approved, and with this kind of question was asked, my response was always, well, every mode of assessment advantages and disadvantages students. And there are plenty of students who are really disadvantaged by traditional academic essay, but we all just tend to assume that that's fine because it's what we've always done. So, I'd rather set assessments that we think are the best we can for the task and the learning outcome that we're working with, and then, address these challenges if we need to and they come up. Another advantage, which has kind of happened completely by accident because we've been working on this for quite a few years, is there's a lot of concern now about students using AI models in their assessments and for things like essays. And actually, these assessments are mostly face-to-face live role plays where you just can't use AI. So we've kind of inadvertently landed on quite a helpful AI-proof mode of assessment just at this moment when that's become a big concern. Then the final point was just to re-emphasize what I said before about limitations with how labor and resource intensive this kind of thing is. Like, for example, we need to pay for the media trainer's time to do the training and then the assessment task, and that's not cheap. And it takes a lot of our time to run these assessments. In a way, you kind of think, oh, it's only 20 minutes per student or 6 minutes to watch a video. That compares favorably to how long it takes to read an essay or something. But once you include reading the short submission in advance and all the other toing and froing that goes on, it takes a lot of time. But we've definitely felt it's been worth it so far. Yeah, so that's it. I think that's what I wanted to share with you. A couple of years of experience of this. We think it's gone really well. We know we're not the first people in the world to invent this sort of thing, so not try to claim too much kind of credit for originality, but certainly in the University of Cambridge, it's quite original and novel to do things like this. And yeah, so far we've been really happy with the outcome, and we think the students have been too. So I will stop there and yeah, throw it open for some discussion, and would also love to hear about things that you've all tried, which maybe are also a little bit outside the box as well. Shelley, are you chairing us at this point, or shall I just ask if anyone wants to?
I normally let people just go for it.
Ricardo.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody. Thank you for your presentation. As you were describing what you guys do and how you made it AI proof, which is very good. I was wondering if you could share with us the rubric and what is exactly that you are measuring and how you are measuring it. Maybe it's grades, university grades, or Likert scales. I was wondering if you could share a little bit of that.
For sure, yeah. So, I mean, I'm certainly for previous years, I may not be able to do it for exactly this current year that's running, but for previous years, we can share kind of everything with you, like the background materials, the questions. I'm very happy to share all of that. For the marking criteria, we have a kind of range of different attributes that we're assessing, on a range from kind of excellent to poor, and then we're kind of putting that together to come up with an overall mark. We don't ever use a very sort of mechanical way of doing that, so we don't say, okay, you got 82% for this and 75% for this, so we'll kind of turn that into an average, because sometimes the criteria could be more or less heavily weighted depending on the particular topic. So we kind of we look at the criteria, we assess across them, and then we come up with an overall mark that we feel is a fair reflection of how well the student did. What we haven't done, well, I'll rephrase that. What we did do was come up with criteria that were broad enough and sort of flexible enough that they allow us to run fairly different modes of assessment under the same criteria. So we're looking more at criteria that are about, for example, you know, how effectively did the student communicate, rather than saying, you know, something that was very specific to a TV interview or something that was very specific to a role play. So we actually use this, you know, we use the same marking criteria for both the things that I described, for example. So they're, you know, they're kind of designed to be a little bit broader. And the main reason for that being that if they weren't, we would have to completely rewrite the marking criteria every year, as we also tried to come up with new questions, and that would become really, really difficult. And would have to happen a long time in advance. But yeah, I'm happy to share the criteria that we have as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for that. I'm curious, when you introduced these new assessment approaches, did you have to change how you delivered the modules to introduce new content to help them be prepared, or new kinds of readings, or any shifts that way, just to sort of facilitate a positive experience for the students?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Not really, because actually we've been teaching this stuff for a long time. So in a way, it's more that we're kind of there's always been a load of stuff that we've been teaching and never assessing, because it was kind of just impossible to assess it through a written medium, or at least to do so effectively. So yeah, I don't think, I mean, maybe we've kind of quite intentionally made sure that we have at least a couple of role play exercises in the first term, just to be absolutely sure that they've had some experience of that. But we've been running the media training classes for 10 years plus without ever really kind of testing them on that. So I think that's been quite a nice thing to kind of reverse. Yeah, the problem we'll probably encounter, you know, if we just keep running with the media interview kind of every year, it comes to a point where it's like we're only really assessing one class, and then, you know, how are we assessing the other things in the module? So that we may have to think about that at some point. And on the other side of it, the actual process we had to go through to get approval, which is quite long. But you know, I don't know what it's like in all of your institutions, but sometimes you can think things are impossible to do until you actually try to do them. And then you find that it isn't impossible at all. So we've always had this, oh, you know, Cambridge is really traditional and no one's ever going to move away from essays. And that we didn't meet any resistance at all. You know, the various committees we had to go through, as long as we were presenting a positive case for why this made sense and you know, how it was going to work, everybody was delighted. So that was nice.
Thank you. You have to get approval for even how, if you shift an assessment strategy?
Yeah.
Like,
pretty much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but your question implies that that's not the case.
Well, not for an individual course, it's true. Maybe if you were submitting one brand new, you had a new novel assessment, you'd have to answer some questions, but you wouldn't need to get an approval to make a change to a course that you were operating. Yeah.
So for us, when the online prospectus goes live, which it will very shortly now for 2026 October admission, with that prospectus, it says how the course is assessed, to the level of like, this module is assessed with a written essay of 4,000 words. This module is assessed with a, once that's in place, you can't change it. It's a legally binding statement that ties you down right the way through until the summer of 2027. So it's quite, it's a long game. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is where I always feel very jealous of those of you who work for organizations that can just turn on the sixpence and try things out and do things differently at will.
Well, hello. Thank you, Chris, for sharing us. It's so nice to see you and hear about this new way to assess students. I am an alumni, for those who don't know. So it's great to hear the changes and how you evolve also in that aspect of the masters. It's really cool. And in CSF, we also do one exercise with like role play. And it's very interesting how people react to that. In that case, they have 5 minutes with someone important. They are also part of an institution, an organization, trying to put the numbers to how a hydroelectrical dam will damage a forest if it is constructed. So they need to present 5 minutes, like an elevator pitch to the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Electricity, the Minister of... So each group presents to a different audience, a person in a specific. And something that we have done, because definitely we find there is people that they just don't feel comfortable about, you know, being there in the spotlight and having to have a conversation and present everything in 5 minutes. The pressure is too much. Many times the language is also a barrier for that kind of exercises. So what we do in that case, and maybe you have done it in the past and I didn't get it, but is that we make groups, like 5 people together in a group working on the same presentation, but then they divide the roles. 1 or 2 people go and meet the minister. 1 or 2 people do the research and actually create the final document, and the other person is in charge of creating, for example, a media kind of announcement, like a post or something to reflect their position about this specific infrastructure project. So maybe you have done that also in the past, but that could be a good idea because not everybody has the skills or just the interest of being in that position, position. And because there is another thing we do. So the audience, because we're not actors, as you said, what we do is we use one piece of cloth to make the difference. So if I'm not wearing this, I can talk to you and, you know, like help you prepare. And then I like this, and I'm the minister. I'm speaking by phone, you're speaking to me, I'm not listening, you know, I'm doing different stuff. So it helps a lot for the person in the role and the person presenting to, you know, like change the chip and say, okay, from this moment, we don't know each other. This is the first time we see each other, and this is the topic that we need to talk about. I'm not going to laugh. I'm not going to be, you know, ashamed or anything. And it helps a lot because you can say that from the beginning. At the moment I'm using this hat, I'm the minister, and that's it. So yeah, so a couple of ideas there that might be helpful. And thank you so much again for presenting.
Yeah, thank you.
Interesting.
Thanks, Natalia. That's nice. I think I like the idea of using the piece of clothing. I suppose what's worked quite well for us is because we're only doing it for sort of 15, 20 minutes is you just make the whole room that space. So, you know, the kind of the moment they come through the door, we try to be kind of in character the entire time until they step out. It did make me think that one thing which maybe is a slight challenge is, you know, we don't want to be assessing students on their kind of creative thinking skills, or like, I mean, well, in a sense we do. I mean, like their ability to kind of make stuff up, right? So in a role play, some of the ones who are perhaps better at it will say things like, well, you know, I've actually literally just come off the phone. I've been talking to my colleague in the country, and we've just made a plan, and this is what we're doing. And that's great, but like it's maybe slightly more their ability to kind of occupy the role and kind of act effectively that's coming through there, rather than necessarily their kind of ability to do the job. So that's kind of trying to in a way minimize the sort of scope for making stuff up in the way that they answer the questions. Anyway, thanks. Anna, you've got your hand up next, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is really this is great to hear, and I think it's brilliant that you're bringing in these kind of mixed methods for this kind of thing. Particularly as I have a child who's sitting her AS levels right now, and it just kills me that her value is being assessed on writing down on a piece of paper for 2 hours. Anyway, I was thinking about how, and I don't know if it works or if it comes through, and it might have been something you answered to Ricardo, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but mean, one of the things we're becoming more and more convinced by in our program is the value and the need for kind of being able to facilitate. And I mean that in the looser sense of the word, sort of being able to hold space for things, whether it's difficult conversations or taking the lead or whatever it is. And I was wondering if any of that comes through in all of this, and if that's something that you look out for, or maybe, like you're saying, it could just be too difficult if it's somebody who's a great extrovert and able to do that. But I was just wondering if any of that comes through in the role plays, and whether it is something that you look out for.
Yeah, I mean, we have a session on creative facilitation skills in the teaching program. Although it happens, I think, after the chief executive sort of board meeting session, which is perhaps where those skills might come through most obviously. But yeah, and also I suppose because to try and make it kind of somewhat structured so it's a bit similar for every student, you know, that board meeting is chaired by one of us who sort of plays the role of the chair of the board and welcomes them and all that kind of thing. So we're not necessarily giving the student too much scope to kind of hold the space themselves. And it would be really interesting actually to think of how we could do that. You know, that would be a fascinating thing to try. Yeah, maybe that's one for the future. Yeah. Thanks, Anna. Chloe, and you must share with us your experience from your perspective as someone we've asked for help with this as well.
I love it. I look forward to it in a way that I probably wouldn't if I was marking essays.
Yeah.
I was really curious, Chris, because you were saying that in the way that it used to be assessed by kind of written assignments, you didn't always feel that people who would go on to be kind of the strong leaders were necessarily coming out scoring particularly highly in your course. Do you feel like you're there now in the assessment? Do you feel like the variety of things now has gotten you to that point, or is it something you're still trying to crack and you're still kind of thinking you might have a little ways to go?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously these things are always hopefully a journey of continual improvement, and we've always got scope to try and improve further. I'll be honest, I haven't sort of sat down and looked at the class list for the last 2 years and sort of really tried to answer that question of how well it maps onto my sense of it. What I would say is that, you know, there have just been times in those interactions, and obviously, you know, you've been there for some of them, where you really feel like, wow, this person has really got something about them, which is coming through so much in their interpersonal, you know, skills, their presence, you know, this sort of sense of, you know, I often find myself thinking after a really good performance, like I would happily work for this person, you know, like I would definitely be a member of their organization. And I think that's just something which is so difficult to convey on paper. And sometimes those people are the same people who would write a really great essay. You know, sometimes that is the case, but definitely sometimes it isn't. And I suppose coming back to the point about language that came up earlier, you know, sometimes people might, I mean, we have a pretty high bar, very high bar for language skills to come into the program at the beginning. And this is happening, the first of these happens in January. So students have had 4 months living full-time in the UK by the time they get to that point of the program. So I'd say that probably the language skills are really good in a spoken kind of conversational setting by that point. Getting your academic writing skills is kind of like a really high, it's like an extra difficult skill, I suppose, in terms of language skills. So maybe some students who aren't absolutely brilliant at that level are still able to perform really, really well in that kind of conversational board meeting context. That's like another way in which perhaps it kind of sets people free a little bit of some of those constraints. I don't know if that makes sense. You ask great questions as well, Chloe. And yeah, part of it comes down to this. I think it's really important for the students to have, you know, Howard and I can kind of pretend to be being board members, but to have a couple of people who they've maybe only met once or never met before. You know, we've had a couple of people who are chief executives of organizations themselves being on the board. You know, it just kind of makes it feel much more real, I think, for the students. So borrowing people in who can help with these exercises, so it's not just, you know, a couple of profs who they would probably have, you know, had a beer with on a field trip or something. Like, it's a little bit more, makes it feel a bit more kind of formal and a bit of an edge to it, which is probably a good thing for this kind of exercise. Just while there's a bit of a pause in questions, I would love to hear if anyone, you know, what some of your organizations are doing to, you know, even if it's not in a kind of formal assessment context, but to sort of enable students to demonstrate some of the learning outcomes, or participants to demonstrate them, that you're working with. That, yeah, Natalia already mentioned her role plays, but yeah, any ideas? Always delighted to hear them. Chloe.
So I should say this isn't our idea, but we saw it and we were wondering about doing it, which is training people in safeguarding. And you can get VR headset scenarios where people are placed in that scenario and they have to kind of interact with, you know, the individuals and play it out as if it were a real scenario. And we were really intrigued by that, because you can obviously go the actor route, which isn't particularly cheap, but can be really impactful. And VR seemed something in between, where I think the cost was a bit less than hiring live actors, but it's obviously a bit better than doing just kind of, you know, e-learning scenarios in terms of engagement. Yeah.
And
so
can somebody else see, can you sort of see what's happening in the virtual space, or is it just the individual with their headset that's having this kind of private experience?
So it is a course that's kind of, you have to pass. So there are, so I'm assuming that either somebody is watching and scoring it, or it's a kind of level thing and you have to kind of get things correct to be able to pass on to the next scenario. So you get scores rather than necessarily being directly observed. Yeah. But I don't know enough to kind of tell you for sure.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. Kahaso?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it probably is very similar to Chloe's. It's a simulation activity that was run by a company called Ability. In the previous job that I had, we used it as a simulation to try and track kind of like leadership and management skills based on scenarios that are actually plugged into the situation, into the simulation itself. So you could probably plug in something around even influence, or how to build relationships and coalitions around different things. So it was interesting in the sense that it provided a safe space, because you're allowed to make mistakes and learn from that mistake, and then you could go to a different, it was like you had different rounds. But with each round, you almost had a team scenario where people were actually scored against the decisions that they actually made. So it was quite interesting. And when, people actually started to develop different kinds of mindsets in terms of how to deal with situations based on what they were able to see as kind of like how they took the decision, how they arrived at the result, and it actually scored everything for them. So it was quite interesting. So as you were speaking, I was just thinking to myself, or asking myself the question in terms of like, what are the different attributes that you were picking up from the different, I know you probably have these that connect to the learning objectives, but I'll just be curious as to what the different attributes that you see show up, particularly at the different stages of the conversation.
Yeah, I guess that also connects a bit to what Ricardo was asking at the beginning about the kind of rubric and the criteria that we're assessing against. Yeah, I don't have them in front of me to recall the full detail, but we're looking at their ability to construct an argument, the way that they're using evidence, how effectively they're communicating, what they're trying to say. Some of those, the sort of classic things that you might expect us to be looking for. but I will share the criteria with all of you, so you can have a kind of closer look at them. There's about 7 or 8 different elements that we're looking at. Yeah, and then I mean, both of you talking about using some. Yeah, I can really see the advantage of using a simulation that could put you into a completely different context, right? Like one that you would really struggle to kind of replicate with an in-person role play, like a safeguarding context, for example. Otherwise, I probably would kind of try and cling on to in-person reality as long as possible, because I do think you can get, even without professional actors, you can get a long way in a role play kind of situation. But yeah, that's a really interesting idea to look at. Yeah, Chloe, if you want to, look at that together sometime, that would be really interesting. Natalia.
Yeah, we don't grade our participants, right? Because it's like courses that are not in the frame of anything academic or university or anything like that. But another thing we use a lot are games. So we have, for example, the potato market game, which is a game that you can find in the literature, because there is actually like a small booklet, I think you call it, with economic games, and that's, for example, one that it's really good. And then it has others that are more related with scarce resources. Scarce. Oh my God, this word.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, that one. Resources. And those games are also really good because people completely change the uptight feeling of having to present, having to do something that is very formal, and they completely change the way they feel with their partners, with the colleagues. And so games are also a really good idea, always. And especially at the beginning of the courses, we use them because it totally changed the way people relate within each other. So happy to share more about the games that we do in another moment if you find them interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. That's also a really good idea. We've been kind of experimenting recently with much more kind of in-depth case study based teaching, but we're not quite there yet in terms of having something that we can probably share with you all from experience. But that's maybe another one which we've been trying, which is more about trying as far as possible to kind of replicate those critical kind of decision-making moments that are very, very difficult to, like, for example, if you're doing a professional placement with an organization, that organization isn't going to sort of hand over, like, line management of a team of 20 people to someone doing a master's program, so it's kind of trying to find ways to create those key intense decision-making points, because otherwise you end up defaulting to what my kind of academic perspective would be, which is like, oh, let's have a think about the pros and cons and write a really reflective essay about it. Well, that's great, but it's not going to help you to like make a decision if you're actually leading something.
We do various simulations that have shifted a bit, like engaging with the legislature is one that we do, and thinking about how to do public testimony on behalf of a bill.
Right.
We also have had a lot of success with what we describe as client-based courses. So we sort of structure a course around having a client that needs a product done. Students have to interact and form a team and be responsive in real time. So slightly different than the simulation, but something that gives a lot of perspective in ways that it's hard for us, we think, as instructors to often do. And kind of back to your point, Chris, about having external folks come in, we have found over the years that it's really essential to have people from the sector reinforce the things we talk about in the classroom. It really seems for students, we joke around about it a little bit sometimes, right? Like as though they may not fully believe us until someone comes in and says, yeah, that is important for us. But I also think it's probably something that we would benefit from doing a little bit more, the simulations, and just because students really generally seem to enjoy it more than a lot of their assessment forms.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, we do a group consultancy project, which is maybe a little bit more like what you're describing there, Nathan, you know, sort of 6 weeks of working as a team with a host organization on a particular topic. Yeah, that's really useful advice. Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the talk, and great to see everyone. We've never used in the Frankfurt Spring School roleplay as a assessment methods, but we introduced it as a part of a course for the first time this year. And for me, I mean, it was not the main thing since it was not an assessment, but I was a bit struggling to give concise and constructive feedback to the students. And I was, because I mean, we did it with I think 25 or 30 people in the room, so it was group work, and it was quite a lot of things were happening, so it was quite difficult to focus on one person and give constructive feedback afterwards. And I know it's a different situation in your course, but do you find it more difficult now to give so apart from the grading, really, like, yeah, feedback, what can be improved, and so on, to the students?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, the students get like a kind of structured form with feedback for every assignment that they do. So we one thing that we found was really important for this task, certainly for the in-person board meeting role play, was that Howard and I meet very quickly after we're done to agree the marks and like discuss them with each other, because although we've taken lots of notes in the meeting, it'll sort of, you know, disappear out of your head quite quickly. Once you've done it with 20 people, you know, you really need to sort of get that down and done fast. And then we split them half and half between us of who's going to write the feedback for each one, which we've agreed in advance. So when we're taking that, and we have like 10 minutes to sort of quickly take some notes and get ready for the next person to come through the door between each one of them. So we're definitely taking notes there with feedback strongly in mind. I mean, I tend to try to write my kind of examiner's comments in a style that is pretty much the same as feedback. So then you can just sort of almost copy them across and make some relatively minor edits to be useful as constructive feedback for the students. But yeah, so they do get some pretty hopefully useful feedback about how they did, both in the written piece and the presentation piece and the Q&A piece, because it's kind of got the 3 stages to it. But yeah, if you were dealing with a larger group of people, or you yourself had any other, like, you know, we have somebody else who's kind of helping to bring the people in and that sort of stuff, because you just need to be completely focused on getting down on paper what you need to after each person is done. Otherwise, you would get completely muddled if you tried to do it later, I think.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So you wouldn't say it's more difficult to give objective and constructive feedback than in an exam or essay or something? Or it's just different, maybe? Yeah.
It's just different. I mean, in some senses, it's almost easier. I mean, because, you know, you've got, I don't know, you can sort of right then and there, you're thinking, okay, they did this really well, they could have done this better. You can just sort of get that down and written up. Whereas sometimes if you read a whole essay, it's sort of, some of the hardest feedback I ever find to give is where you read a whole essay and you just think, that just wasn't really very good. And it's quite difficult to sort of put your finger on, okay, this, you know, you made an error on page 6, you know, it's like just the whole thing just didn't quite work. And that's very hard to kind of communicate as useful and constructive feedback, where maybe in this kind of verbal format, it's a little bit, I don't know, I didn't find it too difficult.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. Right, we're at 3 minutes to the hour. We should probably wrap up and give everyone 2 minutes before your next meetings. Thanks, everyone. I found that really helpful, and hopefully you did too. And it's great to see really good turnouts to these sessions, and long may they continue. Do we know who's next? Did Shelley already say that at the beginning? I've now
Yes,
forgotten.
it's going to be Mar Espinosa.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about their work on the Latin American leadership program development. Yeah.
Yes. Local
Fabulous.
leaderships.
Thanks, Natalia. So hopefully see lots of you then. Bye for now.
Thanks, Chris. See you all.
Bye.
Bye. All.
Bye, thanks.
Bye bye.